A ranch in the Uinta Basin has been home to numerous bizarre and terrifying events.
The dread that fills Skinwalker Ranch can be practically
indescribable.
Oh.
What's up, guys?
There is a stretch of fence in northeastern Utah that should be the most boring thing in the world. For strands of wire strung between weathered posts, sagebrush, red dirt that turns the color of dried blood when the sun goes down. Nothing about it invites a second look, and yet at 17 minutes past 2 o'clock in the morning, with no one awake inside the property and no active investigation running, for separate sensor systems that had never once agreed on anything, all triggered at the same instant. Not one after the other, not in a cascade simultaneously. As if something crossed an invisible threshold and every instrument the team had buried, mounted, and aimed at that boundary felt it at once. When the researchers pulled the infrared footage the next day, they found something moving along that fence line. Not a deer, not a coyote, not a heat bloom, not a lens flare, not an equipment glitch. Something that held a fixed distance from the wire across 47 consecutive frames. Steady, deliberate, patient. And then, between one single frame and the next, with no blur, no fade, no transitional moment of any kind, it was simply gone. One of the people in that review room later described it in a way nobody has been able to unsay since. It vanished, he said, as if whatever it was had understood that it had been seen. To understand why that sentence made a room full of experienced investigators go quiet, you first have to understand the land itself. Because the fence is only the edge of something, and the something has a name. They call it Skinwalker Ranch. It sits in the Uinta Basin, a wide bowl of high desert ringed by mountains, where the sky at night is so clear and so black that the stars look close enough to burn you. To a stranger driving past, it is a working piece of ranch land like 1,000 others. Cattle, outbuildings, a homestead, a mesa rising against the horizon. But the land here has never behaved the way land is supposed to behave. And the people who study it will tell you, if you get them somewhere private and honest, that Skinwalker is different, even from the other places on the map that carry a reputation. Most so-called haunted or anomalous locations do one thing. They sit, they wait. You bring your cameras and your instruments and your hope, and you spend 3 nights in the cold recording nothing, and you go home with grainy footage of a moth. Skinwalker does not sit and it does not wait. Skinwalker produces. That is the word the researchers use. It produces phenomena the way a factory produces product, on a schedule you cannot predict and cannot control, but with a reliability that eventually stops feeling random and starts feeling like something else entirely. And here is the part that gets under the skin of even the most measured investigators. There is a quality to the way it produces, a sense of timing, a sense of response. Bring nothing and it gives you nothing. Bring your best equipment, point it at the sky, and hold your breath, and something happens. More than one person who has spent serious time on that property has said the same uncomfortable thing in almost the same words. It does not feel like weather. It does not feel like geology. It feels like intention. It feels, they say, the way it feels when you turn around in an empty room because you are absolutely certain someone is standing behind you. It knows you are watching. That is not a scientific statement. There is no instrument that measures being watched back. But when you have stood on that dirt at 3 o'clock in the morning and felt the hair on your arms lift for no reason the thermometer can explain, the distinction between science and superstition starts to feel a great deal thinner than it did in the daylight. To find where this reputation comes from, you have to go back to the early 1990s when a family arrived to make an honest living off that land. They were ranchers, not monster hunters. They wanted grass, cattle, water, and quiet. What they got instead, within weeks, not months, weeks, was a systematic dismantling of everything they thought they understood about physical reality. It did not build slowly the way a ghost story is supposed to build. It arrived almost immediately, and it arrived on every front at once. The father documented what happened to his cattle, and what happened to his cattle is the kind of thing that does not leave a person the same afterward. Animals found dead in the open field with wounds so precise, so surgically clean, that the edges looked cut rather than torn. Organs removed with a care no predator possesses. No tracks leading in, no tracks leading out, no blood where blood should have pooled. He brought in people who knew animals, people who had seen every way a cow can die on the open range, and none of them could name a predator or an instrument that made those marks. Coyotes tear, big cats crush, scavengers make a mess. Whatever did this did not tear, did not crush, and did not make a mess. It worked with a precision that belonged in an operating theater, out in a field, in the dark, and then it left without leaving a single sign of how it had come or gone. And the cattle were only the beginning. Objects went missing from structures, music that had been locked from the inside and turned up somewhere they could not have reached. Objects appeared that had never been there at all. And in the sky above the mesa, lights moved. Not aircraft lights, not satellites, not the slow slow burn of a meteor. Lights that changed direction at speeds and angles no aircraft could survive, that stopped dead in the air and hung there, that split apart and rejoined, that violated everything a person learns about how things are permitted to move through the world. The family watched it night after night, and the more they watched, the more they understood a thing that would eventually draw scientists, soldiers, and a very wealthy man to that fence line for the next 30 years. Whatever lived on that land was not random, and it did not seem to want to be understood. It was that last quality, the sense of something deliberate hiding behind the chaos, that turned a family's private nightmare into a matter of professional interest. Because the people who came next were not ranchers, and they were not looking for a haunted house. They were investigators with instruments and training, and a deep institutional distrust of the word impossible. And what they music found, across programs separated by years and staffed by people who never met one another, was not a story that fell apart under scrutiny. It was a story that got stranger the harder anyone looked at it. That is the detail worth sitting with. Most legends behave one way under a microscope. They shrink. Bring in the cameras, the recorders, the men with clipboards, and the phenomenon that thrilled the campfire quietly declines to perform. The Uinta Basin Ranch did the opposite. When a wealthy patron funded a private research group in the 2000s, an organization built to study exactly this kind of thing with exactly this kind of rigor, its investigators arrived expecting to debunk, and instead spent years writing reports that read less like superstition and more like a warning. Their conclusion, buried in the dry language of a research summary, was one of the most unsettling sentences ever produced about that piece of land. The phenomenon, they wrote, appeared to respond to observation. It seemed aware that it was being watched, and more than that, it seemed to calibrate itself to whoever was doing the watching. Think about what that means for a moment, because it is easy to read past and hard to absorb. A rock does not care whether you look at it. A deer flees the instant it senses you, indifferent to whether you carry a rifle or a camera. But the reports out of that ranch described something else entirely. A presence that seemed to register not just that it was being observed, but how well. Bring cheap equipment and you got cheap results, scraps and hints on the edge of dismissal. Bring the good instruments, the sensitive ones, the ones that could actually resolve a signal, and the activity rose to meet them. It was as though the land itself tracked the capability level of the people standing on it and adjusted the intensity of its behavior to the sophistication of the tools they carried. It performed to the exact ceiling of whatever could measure it and not one increment higher. For a long time, that was where the story sat. A haunted stretch of Utah scrubland that seemed to know it was being studied, funded by private money, whispered about by people who had signed things they could not talk about. And then, in 2016, the property changed hands, and the man who bought it changed the entire scale of the question. He was not a paranormal researcher. He had no history of chasing lights in the sky or organs missing from cattle. He was a commercial real estate developer, a builder of the kind of large, unglamorous structures that make a fortune quietly. And he had the one thing every prior investigation had lacked, which was money without a ceiling and a temperament that treated the whole thing as an engineering problem rather than a ghost story. He looked at 30 years of frustrating half-evidence, and he saw a gap. On one side of that gap was the phenomenon doing whatever it did. On the other side was the instrumentation, always a step behind, always arriving with tools calibrated for the last surprise instead of the next one. His theory was simple: close the gap. Throw enough sensors, enough redundancy, enough overlapping technology at the land that whatever it was doing could no longer slip through the spaces between the instruments. And so began the most monitored years in that ranch's long and monitored history. Cameras multiplied, sensors accumulated, teams walked the mesa with equipment that could measure fields and frequencies the earlier investigators could only have dreamed about. Season after season, the record grew, and the man was right about the gap. It narrowed meaningfully. Data that had once been ambiguous started to resolve. Events that had once been anecdotes started to leave signatures. Across 5 seasons of relentless documentation, the distance between what happened and what could be recorded shrank to a fraction of what it had been when the ranchers first stood in that field staring at a dead animal that had bled without bleeding. But narrowing a gap is not the same as closing it, and there remained one gap that no amount of interior instrumentation could touch. A gap so fundamental that not one program in the whole 30-year history had ever even identified it, let alone tried to close it. The private research group had missed it. Music, the government's later effort, the one that produced the redacted documents and the careful silences, had missed it too. Everyone had missed it for the same reason, which is the most human reason of all. They were all looking at the wrong thing, and they were all looking at it together because for 3 decades, every camera, every sensor, every anxious pair of human eyes had been pointed in a single direction. Inward, toward the mesa, toward the Homestead Triangle, toward the zones where the electromagnetic field spiked and the cattle died and the lights performed their impossible geometry. That was where the phenomenon lived. So that was where they aimed. It was obvious. It was correct. And they would eventually realize, a blind spot the size of the entire perimeter. Every program in the history of that ranch had asked the same question. What is is it doing in here? And not one of them had ever thought to turn around and ask what was happening at the edges, out along the fence line, in the hours when no one was watching at all. It was Fugel's team, deep into their years of documentation, that finally noticed the thing hiding inside their own data. Not a new anomaly, but a pattern in the anomalies they already had. When they laid the failures out across a timeline, something clicked into an ugly kind of order. The equipment did not break at random, it broke in clusters, and the clusters had a geography. The closer a camera or a sensor sat to an active investigation zone, the higher its failure rate climbed. Batteries drained in minutes that should have lasted hours. Drives corrupted mid-recording. Instruments that had passed every diagnostic in the morning went dark the moment they were carried up onto the mesa in the afternoon. Move the same equipment 200 yards away, and it behaved perfectly. Bring it back into the hot zone, and it began to die again. That alone might have been dismissed as the effect of some environmental factor, a magnetic anomaly, ground current, moisture in the soil. But the failures were only one thread, and the others braided into the same shape. The aerial phenomena, the lights, the objects that moved against the rules of the air, appeared overwhelmingly during active session windows. Not on quiet nights, not when the crew slept. During the hours when people stood in the field with their instruments raised, asking the land to show them something. And the physical effects reported by the crew themselves. The sudden headaches, the nausea, the strange pressure behind the eyes, the sense of being pressed on from an angle that had no name. Those concentrated during direct engagement. When the team pushed hardest, the land pushed back hardest. When they stepped away, it eased. Think about what a pattern like that does to a room full of rational people. Each thread on its own could be explained. Instruments fail, lights get misidentified, tired, frightened people get headaches. But three independent threads, all pointing the same direction, all correlating with the same variable, the presence and intensity of human observation. That was no longer noise. That was too consistent to be coincidence. Something was tracking the investigation, not responding to it after the fact, the way an echo answers a shout, but tracking it in real time, adjusting to it, calibrating whatever it did to the sophistication of the people trying to catch it. The phenomenon was watching the watchers. It had been all along, and that realization is what finally turned the whole enterprise around, literally. If the thing was aware of where the attention pointed, then pointing all your attention in one place was the surest way to teach it exactly where not to be. Every previous program had built a spotlight and aimed it at center stage, and the phenomenon had simply learned the shape of the light and stepped around its edges. So, the team did something no one had done in 30 years. They stopped chasing. They stopped trying to be where the phenomenon was, and instead built a structure the phenomenon could not move through without touching, regardless of where the human beings happened to be standing. They built a net, not a metaphorical one, a physical, layered, always-on ring of instrumentation wrapped around the entire boundary of the property, running continuously independent of the interior team's position. The whole point was to remove the human variable, to stop giving the phenomenon a spotlight to dodge, and instead surround the land with a boundary that recorded everything, everywhere, at every hour, whether or not a single person was there to see it. And they did not build it with one kind of eye. That was the second lesson of the failure pattern: redundancy, overlap, sensors that measured different things through different physics, so that no single explanation could account for all of them at once. Infrared cameras to see in absolute darkness, reading the heat of a body against the cold of the desert night, acoustic sensors tuned across the full audible range and down below it, into the infrasound, the deep felt frequencies beneath human hearing, the ones that make a room feel wrong for reasons you cannot name. Electromagnetic stations spaced around the perimeter to catch any distortion in the fields and to triangulate its position if it moved. And beneath all of that, buried into the ground itself, vibration sensors, seismic instruments calibrated not for surface footsteps, but for movement at depth, at the specific depths where sonar surveys had already mapped a network of voids and formations running beneath the property like the hollows in a rotten tooth. That last choice mattered more than anyone realized at the time. The ground sensors were not an afterthought. They were tuned deliberately to a range that matched the underground structures the earlier scans had found, the caverns and channels no one could explain, the empty spaces in the rock that had no business being there. If something moved through those depths, the net would feel it. The team had, without quite saying so out loud, stopped assuming the phenomenon came only from the sky or the mesa. They had begun to wonder whether some of it came from below. So, the ring went live and the team settled into wait, carrying with them one last assumption. The quiet, comfortable belief that had gone unquestioned since the very beginning. They believed that when the investigation went quiet, the phenomenon went quiet with it. That the land only performed when it had an audience, and that an empty ranch was a sleeping ranch. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption was, and it would happen at 17 minutes past 2 o'clock in the morning on a night when there was not a single living soul in sight of the fence. The interior of the ranch was empty that night. Not lightly staffed, not quietly monitored from a distance. Empty. The homestead sat dark. The observation posts were unmanned. The interior instrument arrays that usually hummed through the night had been powered down for a scheduled maintenance window, and the crew had gone home hours earlier, back to the modest houses in the towns that ring the basin, back to families and warm rooms and the ordinary business of being alive. No one was inside the fence. No one was watching from within. The only eyes on the property that night belonged to the perimeter ring, the machines the team had built to look inward from the edges, running on their own, faithfully recording nothing as they had for weeks. Nothing was the expected result. Nothing was what an empty ranch was supposed to produce. The night itself was unremarkable. Later, when the team went back through the environmental logs, they found nothing that should have mattered. No storm rolling down off the Uinta Range, no solar activity spiking the fields, no aircraft logged in the corridor overhead, no livestock disturbance, no wind above the gentle background drift that moves through the high desert after midnight. The temperature was falling in the slow, predictable way it always fell out there once the sun was long gone and the ground gave back the last of its heat to a sky full of stars. It was by every measure the instruments could take a completely normal night on a piece of land that had never once behaved normally. And then, at 17 minutes past 2 o'clock, the northern edge of the ranch began to change. It started in the electromagnetic field. The station nearest the northern boundary, one of several spaced around the fence line, each one quietly logging the ambient field strength second by second, registered an elevation. Not a spike, not the sharp jolt of a passing vehicle or a switch circuit. A rise, a steady sustained climb in the field that lifted it clear of the normal range of variance and then simply held there as though something had arrived and settled in. The team knew that range intimately. They had weeks of baseline data for that exact station, the whole envelope of what that patch of ground did on its own. The tiny daily rhythms, the faint pull of the Earth's own field, the background noise of a quiet place. This was outside all of it, and it did not flicker or fade. It held. For 11 minutes it held, steady and elevated. A pressure in the invisible architecture of the field that had no source anyone could point to. There was nothing there. The camera watching that stretch of fence showed empty desert, cold and still under the stars. And yet the field around it had changed and would not change back. Then, after 11 minutes, it began to move. Not the reading, the source. The elevation that it held so steadily at the northern station started to register at the next station along, and then the next sequentially in order, the way a hand might trail along a railing as someone walked its length. Whatever was distorting the field was not sitting still anymore. It was traveling, tracing the boundary, following the fence line around the edge of the property with a patience that no animal, no weather system, no equipment fault has ever shown. Moving from one instrument to the next in a clean progression that the team could later lay out on a timeline like footprints in snow. And here is where the design of the net began to pay for itself, because the field distortion was not the only thing the machines were catching. 2 minutes into that movement, at 19 minutes past 2 o'clock, the acoustic sensors woke up. Down in the infrasound, in the deep frequencies below the floor of human hearing, the microphones logged a sequence. Not random music noise, not the wash of wind or the groan of cooling metal. A structured sequence, patterned, rhythmic in a way that the analysts would spend days trying and failing to match against any natural source in their libraries. And it arrived a full 2 minutes before anything appeared on any camera. Think about what that means for a moment. The ears heard it coming before the eyes could see it. Whatever was moving along that fence line announced itself first in a register no human could perceive. A pressure in the air that a person standing there would have felt only as a vague crawling unease. The sense that they should not be where they were. The exact feeling those infrasound frequencies are known to produce in the human body. There was no human body there to feel it. Only the instruments patiently writing it all down. 2 minutes after the sound, at 21 minutes past 2, the ground answered. The seismic sensors, the ones buried deliberately in the earth, tuned deliberately to the depths where the sonar had mapped those impossible hollows in the rock, began to register movement. Not at the surface, below it. Down in the range where the void network began, the vibration sensors picked up a signature consistent with something moving through the formation beneath the property. The team had wired the ground for exactly this possibility and half hoped they would never see it. And now the readout was climbing, telling them that whatever was tracing the fence above was somehow correlated with movement in the dark spaces below. The two braided together in a way that no textbook, no field guide, no prior report had ever prepared them to interpret. The field, the sound, the ground. 3 separate physics, 3 separate instruments, 3 separate streams of data, all pointing at the same stretch of northern boundary in the same window of minutes. And still, not one camera had shown a single thing out of place. The desert on the infrared feed remained empty, cold, silent to the eye. And then, at 23 minutes past 2, the 4th stream opened. The infrared cameras logged their first anomaly, and whatever composure the team had managed to hold on to up to that point did not survive what the cameras had recorded in the frames just before it appeared. Because in the 3 frames immediately before the shape resolved on the feed, the background thermal environment dropped. Not the anomaly itself. There was no anomaly yet. Nothing there to be warm or cold. The empty desert dropped. The sagebrush, the fence posts, the bare packed dirt, the whole ambient giant field of temperature the camera had been reading steadily all night. It fell in unison in the span of 3 frames, as though something had reached into the scene and pulled the heat out of it a heartbeat before arriving. A pre-arrival signature, a cooling that came before the thing that would occupy that cooled space. And then, in the 4th frame, the shape was there. It appeared across more than one camera at once. That detail mattered more than almost anything else, and the team knew it the moment they saw it. A single camera can lie. A single camera can catch a reflection, a smear on the lens, a moth crossing the sensor, a stray warm current rising off a rock. But 2 overlapping feeds, angled from different positions, both registering the same shape at the same coordinate in the same frame, that is not an artifact. That is an object. Something was occupying that space, and it was occupying it in a way that 2 independent instruments agreed upon completely. And it stayed. That was the second thing that broke them. It did not flash and vanish. It did not streak across the frame the way a startled animal would. Held 47 consecutive frames, the shape present in every single one, moving with deliberation, music tracing the fence line at a fixed distance, and holding that distance with a precision no living thing under stress maintains. A deer bolts, a coyote skirts and slinks and keeps its body low. This moved at a steady interval from the boundary, matching the fence's contour, neither closing in or drifting away, as if the distance itself were the point, as were a line it had chosen not to cross and was walking it patiently, the way a person walks the edge of something they are studying. The heat signature matched no species cataloged in that basin. Not the elk, not the mouth, the mountain lion, not anything introduced or native the reference database held. The dimensions were wrong. The gate matched nothing on 4 legs and nothing on 2. It was not fleeing. Read the frames in order and there is only one honest word for what it was doing. It was observing, and then between one frame and the next, it was gone. No blur of exit, no transitional frame catching it half departed. Present in frame 47, absent in frame 48, and in that same absent frame, the background thermal environment returned to baseline. Not gradually, not over a decay curve, the way heat actually returns to a space when a cold source is removed, warming back slowly, molecule by molecule, the way every physicist and every camera on Earth expects it to. Instantly.